this mountain bell here, which I will ring at 7 minutes, just in case anyone is going over time. So let's get started. I'd like to start by inviting Jean-Marie Pelgam. In his work at the WTO, he oversees work on trade and environment, on agriculture and commodities, as well as the trade policy review. So a huge portfolio, actually. And previously, he was the permanent representative 7 minutes, to the just WTO. In case anyone is going over time. So let's get started.
Sustainable models of trade and production and consumption, which are becoming the threat to the economy. So the vision of the environment as a cost is moving from the vision of the environment as an opportunity for innovation in the green economy. The second change is a change of mindset. In the trade world, we always saw environment as production and consumption, which are becoming the threat, just meant that environment to the superior value. So to trade, vision of the environment as outside moving from the vision of the environment. There has been an opportunity for innovation. Change of mindset since our negotiators are today. The second change is a change of mindset. In the trade world, we always saw environment as moving from an exception to a solution, which are becoming a very important environment to the superior value. So the trade method, trade negotiations traditionally are about give and take. We call that trade concessions. And what is being asked from the trade negotiation today is to contribute to the achievement of collective goals in terms of public goods. And we are learning that into the WTO, of course, with a fishery negotiation, because a fisheries negotiation is not about trade concession. It's not about some countries may lose, some countries may win. Is that if we fail in achieving this global public good of the ocean preservation, we'll all lose. So in other words, since we are in an academic setting, I may say that we are trying to move from the invisible hand of Adam Smith to the cooperative equilibrium from John Nash in terms of game theory. So this is big, and this is happening slowly into the WTO. It's happening, we see it in the private sector. I think corporate social responsibility in many respects is leading the path in contributing to restructuring business processes in the sense that I was mentioning. I think green finance is quite a fast maturing sector also, sometimes led by a development bank. And trade policy is also itself in the process of transforming itself. It is very visible at the level of unilateral, such are preferences, or bilateral, such are FTA instrument, where the environment is quite mature and fast. But it's also coming within the WTO. So where do we stand in the organization? There are several layers. The first one of our multilateral discussion is everything which is happening in our committee on trade and environment. I would just limit myself to saying that over the last 3 to 5 years, this discussion has been very significantly revitalized, in particular under the leadership of our chair, Ambassador Tihanki here. And the discussions are covering most of the major topics today: deforestation, climate change, circular economy, ocean preservation. So there is a very lively dynamic here. The second one is that the environment and sustainable development concerns are pervading increasingly through most of WTO technical discussions. And let me give me an example with climate change, which is very interesting. When you talk about climate change, you see it officially nowhere on the WTO agenda. But when you look at the discussions and what they are concretely, you find climate change everywhere. You find it in the discussion of the Council of Trade on Goods, for trading goods, for instance, with the discussions about carbon adjustment pricing at the border, which have been starting. You find it in trade and services, where there are propositions from our members about liberalizing the trade and services, which help combating the climate change. You find it in agriculture, where the link between distorting subsidies and climate change is being also scrutinized. And of course, you find it in a very technical area, which is sometimes complex to for the external world, which we call TBT, which is technical barriers to trade. And this is actually the most lively one, because this is where our members are discussing all the standards and regulations that they take to achieve goals such as climate change. And if you want to have a more quantitative vision of that, we have an environmental database which shows that our members are using more and more trade as a leverage to achieve environmental objectives, because they notify to us trade-related measures, environmental motivated trade-related measures, which are being captured in our database. And just in a nutshell, this is growing fast in areas such as plastics or circular economy, animal welfare, and others. And last, several groups of our members have initiated some very important plurilateral discussions. You know that plurilateral is less than multilateral, which are trying to converge to some political initiatives at our next ministerial conference called by the end of the year. The oldest one is probably the fossil fuel subsidy reform, which is being pushed by some members, including New Zealand, which is present on the panel. One very focused one is on plastic, led by China and Fiji. It's called Initiative on Dialogue on Plastic. And the most comprehensive one, probably the most ambitious, is called a little bit like your research center is called TEST. So it's Structured Discussion on Trade and Sustainable Development, which is about reinvigorating a work program and maybe sometimes work negotiation on trade and the environment. So this is what we have in the WTO. Let me say a word about the fisheries negotiation, which is really the most important priority of the organization, and of course, the most important sustainable development negotiation. I'll just remind you all that these negotiations have been going on for 20 years. We are hopefully in the final phase. We want to achieve those negotiations before our ministerial meeting in November. And we are now very deeply involved in a text-based process under the leadership of our chairman, Ambassador Santiago Wills from Colombia. Where do we stand? Some members have described specific changes to their support for fisheries that the new disciplines would require them to make, and they have indicated a willingness to make those changes. I'm being told that less encouragingly, however, too many drafting suggestions now are coming back with a view to maintain and even resurrect some positions which have not attracted convergence in the past. So the time is extremely short for reaching an agreement. To get to a deal that will make a positive difference for sustainability in the oceans, all members will have to contribute proportionately to the outcome. I let you imagine that having no result would be the worst possible outcome, both for fish and maybe to some extent for our organization for systemic reasons, since this, I cannot say it enough, this negotiation is the most important one in terms of signal of the WTO readiness to engage into sustainability in the future. I hope I don't get the bell. So happy to hand over the floor back to you, Caroline. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that overview. And I was listening too carefully, actually, to keep track of the time. So I can't say whether you were in time or not, but thank you very much for the overview and for providing us a sense of also what's going on in the fisheries subsidies reform negotiations. We had hoped also to have Ambassador Wills here today, but unfortunately he had other engagements. But I'm sure if there are questions afterwards, that we might be able to answer those. So I'm going to turn directly now to Ambassador Tihanki, who, as I said, is the WTO, is the Philippines ambassador to the WTO and chair of the CTE. He has been chair of the CTE before in 2007, and for several years was also the chair of the special session. And one thing I should note about him is he's also an academic and scholar and has written a book on trade and environment governance at the WTO, which is focused specifically on the CTE. So if anyone is listening who is doing scholarship or research on the CTE, I really commend the book to you because it's a really unique glimpse at this issue from the perspective of someone who's also negotiated and chaired negotiations on these topics. So Ambassador, would you like to talk from there?
Is the mic working from here?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that advertisement. And may I ask just how long, how many minutes was Jean-Marie? 7. Okay, okay. You better ring your. So anyway, of course, thank you to the Graduate Institute and to Carolyn for this invitation. And of course, to my fellow panelists, they have more to say on the specifics. And thank you, Jean-Marie, our eminent DDG, passionate with and trade and environment. May I just say former chair as well of the committee that I'm now chairing. And our fellow panelists, of course, will speak on fossil fuels, TESD, and plastics, 3 very important initiatives. As part of my introduction, I do note that this is the trade and environment and SDGs. Your group, Carolyn, is on the SDGs. And so, and how trade and environment and the WTO, part of what's happening is how the WTO could mainstream and contribute to the SDGs, which I think more and more people are changing the tone of the debate, that we are now actually more cohesive, more coordinated. And I have my favorite on why the SDGs are important, is that first and foremost, among the topics being discussed that is SDG related is sustainable agriculture, brought forward at the last meeting by a group of countries from Latin America. And of course, while you're speaking on plastics, you could probably also say on that. So, and then I see goal 6 of the SDGs is the availability of water and sanitation for all. So I think definitely there has been lots of discussion at the committee over the last 25 years on the importance of this issue to developing countries. Then affordable, reliable energy for all, which is SDG 7. We have Madam Fossil Fuels from New Zealand, and a lot of discussion on solar, on some possible sectors in market access, renewable energies. There's been lots of discussions on the WTO. And then, of course, on sustainable consumption and production patterns, very hot topic today, which is SDG 12, the circular economy, as already mentioned by DDG Jean-Marie. Goal 13, it directly tackles climate change and its impact. And more, as mentioned by our DDG, from 2009, a very important junction in the debates at the CTE and the WTO was the joint report on climate change and trade, done jointly by UNEP and the WTO, which kind of moved the debate at the CTE to a more mutually supportive approach. So today, discussing climate change, while in the beginning was a very big concern, more and more it's being discussed at the CTE and how to address this climate crisis. Then we have, of course, SDG 14, the use of the oceans, and I'm just happy the CTE is not at the forefront. We leave that to Chairman Santiago Wills of the Rules and Fisheries, but there, the committee, to the extent it can, and the WTO is very active in hoping a result on the fishery subsidies. Then we have, of course, forests in Goal 15 and Goal 17. I think the most important is the WTO is part of a global partnership with other organizations. And so we are monitoring closely COP26, which is happening in November as we approach MC12. So indeed, the CTE is not a negotiating platform. There is the special session, which with the Doha round has kind of gone into some hibernation. There is discussions on how to revive those discussions at the CTE SS. But from the CTE perspective, it's mainly a dialogue platform for spreading knowledge, experience sharing, and indeed triggering new ideas. As we have seen, There are new ideas already on plastics. Fossil fuels has been in the discussion for a long time. And of course, TESDI, it will be discussed in detail by Ambassador De Boer, but it's more a more comprehensive approach that allows structured discussions to take place on a non-binding basis outside the committee, but also within the committee as an interface. So there is a lot happening in terms of what the WTO could do in the lead up to MC12. So of course, what is it that we're doing in the lead up to MC12? We are hoping indeed that ministers, as they gather for the first time after 4 years, this will be the first ministerial conference of the WTO, that they indeed provide some guidance, some sort of impetus to all members and send a signal to the outside world that trade and environment, sustainability and inclusivity is indeed a very important topic, together with, of course, the pandemic, the WTO's contribution to the pandemic recovery, and how we can indeed ensure that there's equitable access to vaccines, as well as equitable and free access to free and safe water, less pollution, renewable energy, and all these issues that are becoming mainstream today. So that's what's happening in the WTO and at the committee. I'll leave some time for more questions later. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and another one who stuck just to time, so that's perfect. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ambassador De Boer, who is Canada's ambassador to the WTO. Interestingly, I always like reviewing your biography, because really you started your career in Global Affairs Canada in the Environment Directorate and have negotiated on issues like climate change before moving to the trade side. Ambassador Boer is also with the Ambassador of Costa Rica, the co-chair of the Structured Discussions on Trade and Environmental Sustainability. So thank you so much for joining us.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you for reminding the group that I am here on behalf of the co-convener for TESDI, Ambassador Gloria Abraham of Costa Rica. It's Canada and Costa Rica that are co-chairing this process. And it's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Gloria as well, to talk about the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, and to provide you with an update on the discussions and the work that's been done by participants to date. It's more clear than ever that there's an urgent need for action on climate and environmental issues. And it's also a good moment to ask what can be done to ensure that trade and environmental objectives and policies are mutually supportive. The members of the TESDI came together with the shared belief that the WTO has an important role to play in this discussion. Members hope to complement the work already taking place in the Committee on Trade and the Environment and in other WTO committees and bodies. And they believed that a dedicated discussion group would be useful, and a useful way of enhancing collaboration and incubating new ideas and how the membership could advance their environmental goals. And you heard from the chair of CTE talking about TESDI as an interface with the CTE, and that certainly is one of the notions. When the structured discussions were first launched in November of 2020, 53 interested members expressed their goal of intensifying discussions on environmental themes. And they also hoped, where appropriate, to put forward concrete deliverables, initiatives, and next steps to advance work on environmental issues at the WTO. These discussions have been open to any WTO member, and we've been pleased by the level of engagement, even from countries that did not sign on to the original communication. The initiative is also a bit unusual in the WTO context, as it includes direct participation of international organizations and other relevant actors, including the private sector. The aim is to having these organizations in the room to benefit from their experience and to bring new ideas to the table. We've also been very pleased by the open exchanges that have been allowed, and we appreciate the different perspectives that they have brought to the work. And since the launch of TESTI, there have been 4 meetings of the structured discussion group. During the course of these meetings, we've had an opportunity to hear from the membership about their priorities and hopes for the future of these discussions. Members have raised a broad range of interests, from decarbonization of supply chains, circular economy, trade and climate change, just to name a few. It is clear from the number of areas that have been raised that there is a real interest in exploring different trade and climate-related policy discussions. In our more recent meetings, we've had the opportunity to explore some of the areas through presentations by members, secretariat, and outside groups. As an example, at the meeting earlier this month, we heard presentations on sustainable food and agriculture, trade-related climate measures, and perspectives from developing countries on promoting trade in environmental goods. All of these sessions have allowed for robust exchange between members and the presenters, which have highlighted the value of these discussions. In the course of our meetings, we've also heard from some members about the importance of a roadmap, which would allow us to move beyond information exchange and find ways to put into action some of the ideas that have been discussed. Currently, the co-sponsors are at work on a ministerial statement to be signed at MC12. Through this statement, the co-sponsors will reaffirm their commitment to advancing work on environmental issues at the WTO, recognize the work and discussion that's taken place over the course of this year, highlight areas for future discussion and exchanges, and lay out a roadmap to implement the activities described in the statement. It is our hope that the final draft will reflect a broad range of areas for discussion and future action. One of the goals is to ensure that members will be able to see themselves and their interests reflected in the statement. Ideally, we would like to see a number of signatories expand beyond the original number and bring together a broad range of members. By opening up more avenues for discussion and collaboration, we believe that TESTI can provide a valuable contribution to advancing work on environment and climate change issues. With the eyes of the world turning to the WTO, now is the moment to demonstrate that the WTO can meaningfully contribute to global efforts to combat the myriad of environmental sustainability challenges we face. I and my fellow co-convener look forward to the new statement that will be signed at MC12. We are also eager to see how the membership takes all of the ideas that have been discussed to date and begin to translate them into action as we move beyond MC12. Thank you very much for this opportunity to engage with participants here on the work of TESTI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that overview. I note that you advised us you need to leave a little early, so I'm going to use my prerogative to just ask you one question before you leave, before we turn to the other speakers. And that's simply, I'm thinking from the point of view of stakeholders who are listening. We have colleagues from academia, some officials in environment ministries and capitals, people from the business sector and civil society. How can they help in this effort between now and MC12? I think there's a lot of interest out there among stakeholders in ensuring that the trading system promotes environmental sustainability. And just, do you have any advice on what would help your work in the next few months from them?
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So there's a couple of things I would say, and the one is, do not discount the possibility of working through your own delegations. But then I would also say to work with the existing stakeholder base that is supporting the work of TESTI. There's a lot of interest in increasing the participation, but I don't think we're at that stage yet with respect to the amount of work we need to do between now and MC12. But there is space for those voices. And obviously the way that, I shouldn't say obviously, but the way that TESTI has been created with input from stakeholders, from the private sector, these are voices that are very important. So I would suggest that we work within the existing network of stakeholders and the members to the WTO to bring those stories forward, to bring their advice forward. We do need that advice if we're going to bring about practical steps on the road to MC12 and post MC12. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I recall when the process, all of these discussions started sort of 18 months or so, one of your colleagues had mentioned to me the most important thing was that government officials in capital hear that there's a national demand from this, from national stakeholders. So that's something that I think is really important that we bear in mind, especially if one of the goals is to